The in vogue topic around NFL podcasts right now is quarterback tier list. We're joined by one such man, Eric Eager, who put together a tier list. Plus, we'll talk about the Bengals' future in 2022.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. I'm your host, Jake Liscow. He's your host, James Rapien. Today, we're joined by PFF's Eric Eager, part of the PFF Forecast podcast, along with his co-host, George. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, free and available everywhere you get your podcasts and on YouTube. Thanks for making us your first listen, subscribing, following, hitting the thumbs up, doing all those fun things. Eric, you recently did a quarterback tiers list on your podcast, and there's been an athletic quarterback draft and all these sorts of things. We're at that part of the NFL offseason, and Cincinnati Bengals fans think they have one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. But on your tier list, perhaps controversially to the listeners of this program, but I understand where you're coming from, Joe Burrow, not a tier one quarterback, tied with Justin Herbert at the top of tier two, the way I heard you lay out your tiers. Could you explain a little bit of your methodology and how Joe Burrow landed where he did in your tier list?
Yeah, I think one thing that's really hard for people sometimes is to not assume that a player is who he was last year or even the last time you saw him, right? So where I look at Justin Herbert and I look at Joe Burrow, I think of guys who have played really well through 2 years. Herbert in 2020 was really good under pressure. Not as great in a clean pocket. And then last year he was great in a clean pocket and also really good on late down stuff. Good athlete, things like that. Burrow in 2020 is very encouraging in the first 9 games or so. Got hurt, comes back, led the league in yards per attempt, led the league in completion percentage. When my boss, Chris Collinsworth, asked me who should be the quarterback on his all Collinsworth team, I put Joe Burrow. I thought, he certainly deserved that last year, especially when you consider who he beat, beating Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs twice, obviously the Ravens one time with Lamar Jackson, twice Pittsburgh, so on and so forth, very impressive. But, going forward, we have to remember the sins of the past at times when it comes to being too early on quarterbacks, right? So I brought up on my podcast the example of Carson Wentz. In Carson Wentz year 2, was a Super Bowl quarterback. He took that Eagles team to, I think it was 12-2, 12-1, maybe the first 13 starts. He got them the 1 seed, and then Nick Foles, after the injury, was able to sort of lean into that, play a couple of really good games and win the Super Bowl. And, there's a lot of characteristics in Burrow and Herbert that were similar in Wentz. Big third down variants, big time plays, and stuff like that. And all that kind of stuff regressed, later on. And so for me, I'll still put those guys, 5 and 6 in the NFL in terms of who the quarterbacks are after, Mahomes, Rodgers, Brady, and Josh Allen. But I'm going to throttle it back a little bit and say, look, I need to see a little bit more in terms of years before I jump and put them in the sort of unquestioned, this is a Hall of Fame kind of quarterback type player.
I know we're going to get into the negative part of it or maybe the worst part about Burrow's game, but let's keep it positive for now. What's the biggest thing that stands out about him to you? Because obviously everyone here in Cincinnati and a lot of our listeners talk about his intangibles and different things like that. But I'm sure when you're watching him, something jumps off that might be a bit unique compared to some of us that are watching him as well.
Well, I think with Burrow, you just have the guy who is always rebounding from something, right? So, last season, I got in arguments with Bengals fans, when they took Jamar Chase over Sewell, and I'm just injuries are kind of part of the shtick, and it's kind of noisy, and if you believe in this team, my whole thing with having Chase over Sewell was, you get the higher variance with the wide receiver than you do the tackle. And at some level, like what you want to be able to do when you're buying into a guy like Joe Burrow with the first overall pick a couple of years ago, you're buying into a guy who can overcome, some deficiencies, right? That team was 2-14 2 years ago, and it made the Super Bowl 2 years later. Like, that is still too short of a time to have a perfect roster. So, where they sloughed off a little bit was on the offensive line. And, Burrow took sacks as a result. He took the most first down sacks in the league. He took the most sacks in the league. And, ultimately he rebounded from that kind of stuff, and he had the gumption there. There are going to be people who say, look, sacks and pressures are a quarterback stat. And I certainly agree with them, but it's also, part of, being able to come back from that. I don't know if it's predictive or not, but when I watch Joe Burrow, I think he's never really out of a game. And to me, I think that is characteristic of a lot of the great players that have played in this league before.
He has a pressure to sack problem, to use a PFF column that I was following throughout the year, because in his first 2 games of the season, when he was not very comfortable with that knee against the Vikings and the Bears, pressure to sack in both of those games over 40%. Later in the year, never quite got as high, besides that crazy Titans game when the Bengals couldn't block stunts and twists to save their life. But it mostly calmed down as the season went on, and as many clips as there are of him maybe extending a play into a sack that he shouldn't have when he could have gotten rid of the ball, there are also plenty of good highlight tape kind of stuff of him evading should be sacks, because, as you discussed, the Bengals offensive line was porous. Another PFF stat for you, the PFF guest on our show today, is that according to the allowed pressure by responsibility table that I'm looking at, Joe Burrow, very average at 10% of his pressures you guys charted to the QB with some responsibility, which is, right in the middle of the pack, maybe slightly better than average in terms of comparing to the rest of the NFL. How do you evaluate which sacks are Joe Burrow should avoid this? Joe Burrow should have done something different here from a macro perspective. Are you looking sack by sack when you're talking about he's taking too many sacks? Are you looking at overall data, or where is that coming from? Because I know you guys have done a lot of analysis on the sack stuff with Burrow.
Yeah, I think, a lot of times it's in our grades. But the thing it's like, you look at the aggregate level, it's like sack, pressure to sack is a quarterback statistic. I think when you look at a player like Burrow, he had 17 turnover-worthy plays, 16 interceptions, but down the stretch, he only had 2 interceptions after week 14. Like, I think some, players will take sacks in lieu of throwing interceptions. And sometimes that can be a good thing. A throwaway or two probably wouldn't hurt the guy. He didn't have as 23 of those. You look at a lot of players are sort of up there more in the 30s, 40s. Rodgers set the record with, I think, a little bit under 60 one year. But yeah, it's going to be mostly in the grades, and we do, we'll track when a pressure is a quarterback's fault. I think in the case of Burrow, it's a little bit of yes on both ends. It's like the offensive line was terrible, and and you look at early in the Super Bowl, for example, like Aaron Donald, that really didn't have a pressure in the first, 40% of the game or so, when they were getting the ball out quickly and things like that. And then they got a little bit too comfortable in the second half of that game. And you saw, like, part of me is like, when you're the quarterback of a team, you sort of have to take the good with the bad with your team. And if your offensive line's terrible, they're still going to blame you, And so when I think about, separating credit and blame, I think ultimately it's about a 50-50 thing on average. And individual plays, obviously, like, that'll be embedded as sort of into the PFF grade.
We'll continue our conversation with Eric Eager of Pro Football Focus and dive into how the Bengals tried to get Burrow more protection this offseason. We'll do that next right here on Locked On Bengals. But first, a word from Rock Auto, your one-stop shop for all of your auto parts needs, whether you're looking for something as simple as a cabin air filter, right? Where you don't want to pay the dealership to do that because they're going to overcharge for something that you can learn on YouTube in about 5 minutes. Well, you could go to rockauto.com and save money there. Or maybe you are an intense mechanic that can replace fuel pumps and other stuff that, I got to be honest, I'm not handy enough to do. rockauto.com is going to save you money. You're going to get the same quality parts you get at the big box store or the dealership for much, much less. They've been in the business for more than 2 decades. Check them out right now, rockauto.com. See all the parts available for your car or truck, and be sure to write Locked On in their How Did You Hear About Us box so they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com.
Eric, looking back at the QB annual, Joe Burrow had the number 1 clean pocket grade in the NFL in 2021. A big focus for the Bengals this offseason was going out into free agency and addressing the biggest problem that they encountered in their playoff run when Joe Burrow took all those sacks against the Tennessee Titans, and they couldn't pass block to save their lives in the second half against the Rams and run a functional offense. But the guy in your most stable metric, as far as I recall, is elite in the clean pocket. They added 3 significant pieces there. How do you look at what the Bengals did this offseason from a team building perspective and evaluate that? I know some of your coworkers have called them like exemplary, a model, and something to strive for. What's your opinion?
Well, when I look at the Cincinnati Bengals and how they've gone about their business, like it's exactly almost I wouldn't say word for word, but it's sort of chapter and verse of like what we would do at PFF. Frankly, when we look at coverage versus pass rush, it's like coverage is a weak link system, whereas pass rush is more of a strong link system. So this team goes out last season and gets 6 or 7 defensive backs who had 1,000 snaps, right, with other teams in the past. And they said, look, we're going to let the best 5 guys win. They go get Trey Hendrickson. They spend money on him. This offseason, they go and they say, look, the offensive line is a weak link system. We don't necessarily have to go out and, let's say, get, like a Trent Williams or a Teron Armstead, but you can go out and get a La'el Collins, a player who I think is not necessarily elite, but is good enough. Like if he's average, and then Jonah Williams is average, and Karras and guys like that are average, then this will be an immensely better offensive line than it was before, and you don't have to break the bank for it, right? Because right now, you have the money with Chase and Higgins and Burrow making what they're making. The secondary being a bunch of modestly paid men, other than Jesse Bates. You can go out and literally buy competence at all those different positions. You can't buy eliteness at all those different positions, but I think they understand that. And so now going into life, in the 3rd year of Joe Burrow, probably going to extend him next year, it makes a lot of sense to do what they did. So I'm really a big fan. I'm very interested to see how it ends up turning out for them.
Eric, they drafted Jackson Carman in the 2nd round last offseason. Obviously, he had a bumpy, maybe underwhelming rookie year. They take Cordell Volson in the 4th round. And that's kind of it as far as, left guard is concerned. It's not like they brought back a veteran like Quentin Spain or signed another veteran to fill that void. How concerning is that they do have this one hole where, yeah, there are guys they've invested draft capital in that could compete for that spot. And there's some other guys I'm leaving out, but there's no clear-cut guy that's going to start at left guard, and it's going to be a competition. Is that a big concern, especially when you describe that system where there could still be one weak link on the Bengals offensive line?
It certainly is a concern. I think, ultimately you'll still be fine if you're basically taking, you're looking for a player there who can sort of play, you're sort of looking for a player who can play out of 4 or 5 guys who, you're making a good gamble, right? Like the hard part is when you need, let's say last year, let's say they need 3 guys out of a group of 4 all to do well. That's a really bad gamble, right? If you need 1 guy out of 3, that's a fairly okay gamble. And given where they are as far as draft capital, given where they are, as far as cap space, like it's not beyond the wit of man for them to patch it up even more. Let's say if, they end up with, let's say they end up with, a position where none of those guys work out, they could go ahead and make a trade, in the preseason or something like that to get a guy. Like guards are relatively cheap in the NFL if you don't want to get an elite guy. So I think they're set up in an okay position. Like I said, in the secondary last year, they made a gamble and said, look, we're going to throw like 8 guys and we're going to need 4 after Jesse Bates. At offensive line, it was almost like we need 3 out of 3 guys to work out for this to make sense. 3 out of 4, which is a bad gamble to need. Now, if it's like 1 out of 3, they should be okay.
Especially with attrition in the NFL being a significant factor. Now, the Bengals and Bengals fans, I would say, feel like they've added pieces to their team that address significant holes. And opposing team fans would say, well, they were incredibly lucky last year for health. They were lucky in close games. They were lucky on 50-plus yard field goals, which I think Bengals fans would take particular objection to. They really like Evan McPherson in Cincinnati. When you're looking at how they've attacked the offseason and looking around the AFC, it doesn't necessarily look like people are falling over themselves to say, yeah, they're going to come out of the AFC again. They're better. They were the Super Bowl team. They're better. What's your overall feel when you look at what they've done? Is there something that could have been enough? Or do you think that they're the Bengals, they need to prove it in national media and in the betting markets?
Yeah, so they're not the favorite. Well, it depends upon which book you look at, but they're not the favorite to win the division. I think if you say, let's say there's an alternative universe where, they lose to the Chiefs at home in week 17 and Cleveland beats Pittsburgh, let's say, you're in like a win or die situation in week 18 with Cleveland. Just to win your own division. Maybe they win that game, maybe they don't. But if that happens, you're a 9-8 team. And I think if they were 9-8 and maybe out of the playoffs, let's say, what would our expectations be of them is maybe a good question to ask because, and granted, they beat the Chiefs. And I honestly think that they played the Chiefs like a fiddle in that week 17 game at the end. But there are a number, or Minnesota, let's say Dalvin Cook, that fumble in week 1 isn't a fumble, and maybe they tie that game, or maybe the Minnesota wins, and they're 9-8. And we all look up, we're talking about how encouraging the season was. And if you say, let's say they're plus 225 or so, plus 215, plus 200 to win the AFC North, I think all of us are like, oh, that's pretty fair, right? So that's kind of how I like to look at it, is to say, well, if we rerun the season over again, where do they finish? And I think we did get we found out last year that the Bengals are capable of winning the Super Bowl. I don't necessarily know if we found out that they're a Super Bowl favorite because of how many things had to go right for them. If they have to go to Buffalo instead of Kansas City in the AFC title game, how does it shake out there? If Kansas City scores 1 touchdown in the second half of the AFC title game after a half in which they gained all but 1 yard available to them, what does this look like? If they lose the AFC title game, what's our expectation of them this year? All those things, in tow, like I think there's a really good chance that this team is improved and it doesn't get better from them from an outcome standpoint. And that I think is okay. I think, I was on Ken Brew's show. Like I sort of said, look, Bengals fans, like this is going to be a good decade. That doesn't necessarily mean that 2022 is going to be better than 2021. And I think that we've seen this a lot of times in the NFL where, a team has an unexpected pop-up year, expectations are maybe too high, and then things don't quite go as well and they blow things up. I'd hate for the Bengals to let's say go 11-6 and lose in the first round of the playoffs. Is that a recipe to look at Zach Taylor differently this year? I don't think so. But I do understand why expectations are so high.
No doubt about it. And Eric, I want to ask you about Dax Hill and what the Bengals did in the draft. Plus, we need to talk about the rest of the AFC because it's a murderer's row. It's going to be quite tough for the Bengals to repeat. But first, I got to tell everyone about the number 1 protein bar on the planet, Built Bar. And right now, they just released Brownie Batter Puffs, which, if you haven't had a protein-infused marshmallow, they're the best things ever. And especially if they taste like brownie batter. Who doesn't like brownies? Who doesn't like brownie batter? Well, Built Bar has come out with an elite way to get your protein daily, whether you want just a healthy snack midday or you want to get a protein punch post-workout. They have 17 grams of protein, 140 calories. So check those out. Check out all of their flavors at built.com. Use promo code LOCK15. You'll get 15% off your order, whether it's the brownie batter puffs. All the other puffs are just a standard Built bar. Check them out right now. Built.com and use promo code LOCK15 for 15% off. Eric, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the draft for a second. The Bengals picking much later than we're accustomed to. I know on draft night I was waiting around at Paul Brown Stadium for the announcement, which is not something we're used to here in Cincinnati. And they end up with Dax Hill. What did you think about that selection and how he fits? And do you think it was a good value? Because I think a lot of people viewed it that way, but I'm curious about your thoughts.
Yeah, I think he's kind of the new, thing that the NFL is looking for in a safety is like, you have, Tyrann Mathieu, for example, in Kansas City now, and, previously in Philadelphia, now in, New Orleans, a guy that can play in the slot, but can also play deep. Because you have so many systems now where, you want your defensive line, you want to be able to play 6 men in the box. And if that's going to happen, you need a safety who can play the run, fit the run like a nickel cornerback, but also have the shiftiness to cover slot players. And then also be able to play deep when things, arise there. There's the uncertainty about Jesse Bates and whether or not he's going to be able to, whether they're going to be able to come to an agreement with him. And that, should obviously, cloud a lot of sort of what we're working with there. So that's kind of where I'm at is like, I think it's just a nice buffer against some uncertainty in that secondary. You look at the corners, Awuzie, Apple, Flowers, guys like that. There's uncertainty there, but like you throw numbers at the situation. At safety, you have Von Bell and Jesse Bates, but you needed a third guy there. I think to really curb against, because when teams have success, we saw it in Kansas City. We've seen it in a lot of other places. Like the players, Bates got an interception in the Super Bowl. He's probably thinks, and probably rightfully so, probably thinks he's a huge part of this thing and wants to be paid accordingly. And, he sees down the road a guy like Joe Burrow getting a lot of money. And that, he might want to leave. He might want to go somewhere where they can pay him more money. And that should be fine. But then that gives you Dax Hill and the versatility he provides in a secondary that got a lot better last year.
They invest a lot in the secondary in Cincinnati. They did so again in this draft. And that was a big part of their success with Lou Anarumo getting creative, as we saw in the playoffs against the Chiefs and against a totally different game plan, for example, against the Titans, and coming out with yet something different against the Rams. And that flexibility seems like something that's important to him. But going forward, looking at the AFC, looking at the trends around the NFL, the increasing pendulums swinging back toward more too high shells, more too high safety coverages that some prognosticators seem to think will be a problem for Joe Burrow. And we'll see what happens there. But just a talent infusion in the AFC where it felt like 95% of the elite players that moved this year went from the NFC to the AFC. Plus, it felt like, teams like the Ravens and the Jets and the Colts, well, not the Colts, but the Ravens and the Jets in the draft had 3 first-round picks each or something like that, it felt like. And the Colts had Matt Ryan, and I think the Colts are going to be a surprising thorn in the side of the AFC. You talked about expectations. The Bengals can do it, but with the schedule they have and the increased obstacles in the AFC, how do you see a pretty brutal conference shaking out this year?
Yeah, it's going to be tough. I mean, when you look at, the AFC South is pretty soft. I think that the Colts and the Titans, probably you're going to look at one playoff team there. And it's really going to depend upon how 2 similar quarterbacks of Ryan Tannehill and Matt Ryan, shake out. When you look at the AFC East, like you could squint and see only one playoff team there in Buffalo. I think Buffalo is probably going to be the 1 seed just because of how strong they are, but also, that division, there isn't a peer for them in that division. So then you look at the other 2 divisions, and I think in the AFC West, you have 4 teams who expect to make the playoffs. The Vegas Raiders are all in. You look at their cap situation in 2023, it's not great. They're going to be over the cap when the year hits, I think. And they're only going to have like half their roster signed. Kansas City obviously is always going to be in the mix. LA and Denver, really, really loaded up to try to contend against the Chiefs. And then you look at the AFC North, the Ravens are a team that in 8-9, they lost their last 6 games, all games that Marlon Humphrey was injured in or wasn't playing. And all those games were by 3 points or less, except for the game against the Bengals here. And that one, Josh Johnson was starting for the Ravens. So that I think they should be strong. They got a lot of draft picks that I think a lot of people like as well. The Browns are, that's the bugaboo there. I think from team, player 2 to 53, that's a really good team. The quarterback position is still going to be a question mark with as far as suspensions and things like that. Head coach is good in Stefanski, so that team is going to contend. And you can never forget about the Steelers. There's a good question as to whether or not Mitch Trubisky's an upgrade over Big Ben because I think Big Ben was really holding that team back last year. Mike Tomlin's a great coach, so there's just a lot of contenders there, and I think a team like the Bengals are equipped. I mean, they have the quarterback play, they have the roster depth and stability to compete there, but it's just not going to be easy. And kudos to the Rams last year. Kudos, to the Bengals. Ultimately, last year was a weak year in the NFL, right? And so the Rams saw it and went all in. They ended up going in and winning it as a 4 seed against another 4 seed. I don't think that this year is going to be a weak year in the NFL, specifically in the AFC.
Interesting that you can have weak years in a league with so much parity, but the parity is why we get these sorts of swings like we do. My last question for you, Eric, is a quick fun one. I know you went through the schedule recently. The Bengals have 5 primetime games this year, which is as many as they've had in like the last 5 years, it feels like. That might actually be the number, but they don't get into the spotlight very often. They're there a ton this year. Did any game stand out to you as a particularly attractive game to watch as a football fan?
Yeah, I like. I'm probably going to go to I go to a lot of Bengals games weirdly, but the one I'm really looking forward to is when the Dolphins come here on that Thursday night, I believe.
Yeah, that's right. Week 4.
I'm that might be a night where Collinsworth gets his number, or they don't retire numbers, but he gets in the the Ring of Honor. Last year they put a few members in there for the inaugural group. So that's one. Obviously, Kansas City coming here is always going to be a great game. I think Burrow, showed himself twice to be up to the task. It's always cool when Cleveland comes here because, everybody's pretty rabid there. They close, with 2 home games against 2 great teams, I think, in the Bills and the Ravens. So, we might have to wait all the way until January to find out what they're really made of in a lot of ways. But if you have – you think about if you're a Bengals fan and you look at the last 6 games of the year, 4 of them at home, you get the aforementioned Browns, Chiefs, Bills, and Ravens all here. That's a pretty fun stretch. And then obviously you go to Tampa Bay and go to New England. So, the 2 goats of the last century. It's a great schedule. It's going to be a hard schedule. And they get a little bit of a break in the middle with the NFC South, the Falcons, Saints, and Panthers, 3 out of 4 weeks. But it's going to be a good schedule. Like I said, they could be a better team this year and take a step back. And I think Bengals fans, I'm not trying to be a hater. I'm just saying be prepared because this year is going to be a gauntlet.
Eric, what do you get your boss? Because no one can really relate to this. What do you get your boss if he gets inducted into the Bengals Ring of Honor? I mean, you better start planning now because I don't know what the hell you would do if that happens.
Chris is the nicest guy who never wants to take anything. So I would, I mean, and he's got all the money in the world. So sure. I don't have any idea what I could get him, but maybe I'll give him twice as much for his Sunday Night Football packet. So he has to prepare half as much.
There you go. That's it. You help him with his prep. Well, he is Eric Eager. Make sure you follow him on Twitter at PFF_Eric. Check out the PFF Forecast podcast as well. Eric, man, this was great. Appreciate the time. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me on, guys. Take care.
Always great to have Eric Eager on the show. That's going to do it for this episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. We'll see you next time. Hoo day, and have a good one.